What do you think of when you think of the word religion? If you're like most Americans, the word religion probably conjures up a few images for you, and probably a few that aren't so nice. You might think of a church, or maybe a synagogue or a mosque. You might also think of politics. Some lady in Alabama who refused to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple, maybe. Rallies outside of Planned Parenthood. The fight for access to safe and legal abortions. The way non-Muslims react to Islam, whether positive or negative. If you're like me and you went to Catholic school, you probably think of First Communions, confirmations, masses you were forced to sit through, and the vacation Bible school your parents made you go to over the summer. Our view of religion in America is largely Christian-centric, and more often than not for a lot of people these days, negative. Because of all the touchy issues we associate it with, it's something we spend a lot of time trying to avoid in conversation. Perhaps you've heard the old adage about not talking about politics or religion. But unless you've been living in a cave for the past few millennia, you'll know that these subjects are practically unavoidable. So I think it's time to change the way we talk about religion. The first step is to change the way we think about what religion is. If you walk up to a religious studies scholar and ask them to define religion, you may be in for a long-winded philosophical discussion, one riddled with the complex vocabulary and dense theory that permeates much of religious studies scholarship. But more likely than not, you'll get a much simpler and much more truthful answer. We just don't know. Really, a big part of modern religious studies revolves around the idea that we may never be able to succinctly or adequately describe what constitutes a religion. But there are a few concepts in religious studies that can at least help us wrap our heads around it. You're probably familiar with this term. A rite of passage can be defined simply as the transition from one state of being to another. In a religious context, we often think of things like First Communion and bar and bat mitzvahs. But even if you don't belong to a religious institution, you've probably gone through some rites of passage in your life. Graduating high school, becoming a licensed driver, going to prom for the first time. If we expand our definition of a rite of passage to include events like those, it helps us think about the ways in which aspects of religion affect our everyday life. When you think of sacred texts, you probably think of things like the Christian Bible, the Torah, the Quran, or maybe even something like the Rig Veda. But a sacred text can just be something that is particularly special, important, and powerful to a particular community. The same thing can apply to places and people, too. This is a tricky one, but one of my favorite ideas about religion. The term was coined by the sociologist Emile Durkheim, an important figure in religious studies. Basically, collective effervescence is the feeling that comes from experiencing an event or participating in an action as a community. It's the feeling of being caught up in a moment, in something bigger than yourself. For example, the feeling you get when everyone's singing along at a concert, or when everyone stands and cheers after a touchdown. That's collective effervescence. Now that we know a few basic terms, I'm going to show how they can be applied to aspects of our everyday life that most people would never consider religious. To do that, I'm going to use an example I hope everyone is familiar with. Star Wars, or specifically, the Star Wars fandom. So click here for part 2.